pleasure today to welcome Geoff Henderson. Geoff is one of our long-standing members, I think. He was telling me he had a career in IT, was it? And his sort of interest in art, really, which he's always had, has really blossomed since he's retired. And I'm sure we can all sort of relate to that, you know, might have interests when you're in work, but you simply haven't got the time to develop them. So anyway, looking forward to, I'm sure, will be a very interesting talk. It's Van Eyck, the painter. Any relation to Dick?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Okay, could you please welcome Geoff in the usual way, please?
Thank you. Can I be heard? Yes. Thank you. I was never a teacher, so I never learned to shout. with apologies to the teachers in the room, but not terribly sincerely meant. We don't know much about Van Eyck, really. There's no certain... Right. There's no certain portrait of him, but this is believed to be a self-portrait. He was born around 1393 in Maastricht, then in the Duchy of Burgundy. By about the early 1420s, so when he's about 23 or 24, he's already being talked about as a serious painter. In one document, he's described as a maestro. And Gombrich, who's a famous art historian, said that Van Eyck was the first man to conquer reality. He was a man on the rise. He had a brother, Hubert, who was an equally talented artist, but died relatively young. But at the time, it was pretty much only in Italy that artists were written about. So Van Eyck was famous in the Netherlands and became famous subsequently, much, much later on. 14 years after his death, he was described as the leading painter of our age by an Italian art historian. So this is what we think is a self-portrait of his. And I describe him as the first master of oil paint for a reason that I shall explain in the course of the next half hour or so. And he was a long way ahead of his time. Okay, so he's 50 to 70 years ahead of Bosch, for instance, 100 years ahead of Holbein, 50 or 60 years ahead of Leonardo. So he's a real trailblazer. This is possibly his earliest work. This is ink on parchment, and it's from the Book of Hours and some illustrations that he did. And you see shades of this subsequently in his later works. This was commissioned by a friend of the Duke of Burgundy, who was Philip the Good, who I've described in the past as Philip the Philanderer, and I'll explain why in a minute. And he was paid a quite substantial sum to become the court painter to Philip. So this was a man who was never going to be short of money. Not only was he appointed court painter to Philip, but he was given permission to accept other commissions. And that was very unusual for a court. His role included all sorts of things as the court artist: coats of arms, heraldry, pottery, silverware, goldware, all sorts of things. But he's predominantly remembered for his oil paintings because they have survived. And this also shows something. These are relatively small objects. And what this shows is a mastery of detail. And this is a theme that runs right throughout his work. This is his patron, whose court was the most wealthy and the most glittering in Europe. This was painted not by Van Eyck, but by a contemporary of his, 9 years after Van Eyck died. So we have no painting of his patron done by Van Eyck. But he married 3 times. He had 17 acknowledged illegitimate children. But he was a good picker of men. And one of the men he chose was the chap who designed the hospice in Bone. So he had an eye for talent, and he had an eye for recruiting people and keeping them, and he paid them well. And Van Eyck was sent off to Portugal to meet Isabella, because she was a prospective wife to Philip, and he sent Van Eyck off to say, bring me back a picture of what this lady looks like. This is a copy, and it's now in a private collection, but it's not terribly flattering, I don't think. But then, as you'll see from his portraits, he wasn't one to flatter his sitters by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, I've called him the first master of oil paint. And why did I do that? Well, prior to the invention of oil paint, the first thing that people painted with was just pigments and water. And the pigments, if they were from stone or something, were crushed by this sort of device. And you put a spot of water in it and off you go. And I'm not much of a painter myself, but I do find that painting with watercolor is the toughest thing to do, because it's very unforgiving. If you make a mistake with watercolor, it's very hard to cover it up. You make a mistake with oil paint, and it's a doddle to cover up. And it also doesn't last long. If it's exposed to sunlight, it will fade quite quickly. So most watercolors don't last. And that's why there are almost none that are more than 100 years old. Then somebody had the smart idea of adding egg yolk. And we have something called egg tempera. And the wall paintings you see in churches are done with egg tempera. That's balanced it, made it stickier, made it longer lasting. So it's not unusual to see wall paintings that are 1,000 years old. And it's not that unusual to see wall paintings in egg tempera that are 2,000 years old. And some of it was painted on wood, less so than walls, but they exist and they've survived to this day. So that was a big leap forward. But before I get to oil paint, and it's still used today, egg tempera, and it's capable of great subtlety as a medium. This is a wonderful picture, I think. And this won second prize in the BP Portrait Artist of the Year competition for 2016. And it's the grandmother of the artist lying in hospital. And it's almost photographic. It's a wonderful, wonderful picture. And I was delighted to see when it was egg tempera. But Van Eyck and one or two other people experimented with adding oil, linseed oil, nut oil, any oil that they could find, nuts from flowers, from whatever. And they created a paint which took longer to dry, but kept its color, didn't run, and was much easier to play with. And you could lay one layer on top of another, and build up color and density and subtlety, all sorts of things. And you could create a jewel-like quality with oil paint, which you couldn't do with egg tempera or watercolor. And this is an example of what Van Eyck could do with a paintbrush and oil paint. This is a detail from the Ghent Altarpiece that I'll show you in a second. But that's a wonderful thing to create. And they survive. That's the other wonderful thing about oil paint. They survive for hundreds and hundreds of years, and if they painted on wood even longer, of course the wood will crack and all sorts of things will happen. And oil paintings can be stripped off canvas and replaced on new canvas. They can do all sorts of things to keep the image alive. But that's the sort of thing that could be done. And Van Eyck was the first man to do it. And this is the Ghent Altarpiece. It's huge. This is 8 foot high. So what's this room? About 9 foot? 10 foot? Chunky. And it's 6 foot wide. And there are 12 panels in it. It's still in St. Bravo's Cathedral in Ghent, and I think it costs €10 today to go in to see it. And it is regarded as the first major oil painting in the world. And it's regarded as the masterpiece of the Northern Renaissance. And it was a collaboration at the start between Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert, who lived only a year or two into the painting of this. And there are a couple of things to notice about it, that the figures on the bottom are all in proportion with each other. These are smaller, and these are smaller again. And then you've got this interior view that I'll show you a bit more detail of. And these aren't statues, these are paintings made to look like statues. And these two are terribly important, because he's the chap who paid for the altarpiece. And if you paid for the painting, you got to be in it. So it's a bit like building a football stadium and having it named after yourself. But they didn't have football stadiums at the time, so they did do with altarpieces. And this is the chap who paid for it, and this is his wife. And you'll see there are some themes in this that occur now through a lot of his pictures, which is as an interior view. The figures are not dead center, they're off to one side, so you can see what's in the middle. And of course, it's deeply religious. Most painting at this time was deeply religious. This is the Archangel, and Gabriel, and he's appearing to the Virgin Mary. And if you look at the interior, you've got this niche here. This is a towel hanging off a rail, and the rail is sticking out of the wall like this, and the towel is hanging off it. Everything in these pictures is there for a reason. It's all designed to communicate something. And these are four separate panels, separately painted. But even though they're separately painted, it's one picture. And in the background, this is Ghent. And people are quite clear that when he painted this in Ghent, and this is a painting of Ghent. Use Vid is the man who paid for it. And he was a high official in the cathedral. And it's very realistic. Right? I mean, this does look like a statue, but it's cold, solid, immobile. This is clearly a person. You can see the veins on the back of his hands, the wrinkles. There's no attempt to pretty this man up. This is realism, and this is classicism. And in portraiture, this is probably not painted from a statue, it's out of his imagination. And this is what he's seeing. So when you're doing religious paintings, mostly because you're not seeing the people doing the painting, it's all coming out of here. Whereas you paint a portrait and you're painting someone you can see in front of you. And this is an extremely poor image, but it was the best one I could find, just to give you the scale of it when it's open. This is a photograph taken inside the cathedral, and these are the people looking at it. So it's almost as high as this, and now it's 12 feet wide. It's most of that. It's colossal piece of work. And you imagine how people would have felt walking in when it was closed, and then the revelation of seeing this triptych opened. And you've got a similar sort of effect now. This is all in one scale, one proportion. With the skyline, it's clearly one picture, although it's 5 different paintings. And the scale here, he's the largest figure, next largest, smaller again. This is Adam and Eve. This is the Fountain of Youth. And it's everything's there for a reason. And here's some detail of it now. And you can see the jewel-like quality of the oil paint. You couldn't do this with watercolor or egg tempera. It's oil paint that's enabled you to do this. There's a sort of hint of Byzantine art in it. Hint of everything, really, but it's pretty majestic and it's wonderfully executed. And St. John, who's on the right here, is normally shown as rather an unkempt figure, but in this one he's rather more decorous. And these two paintings, these two panels are very, very clever. You can see the underside of his foot here. And it's almost as if it's painted from down here, looking up at them. Whereas the other characters in the top register, you're looking directly at them. And these two things at the top are also paintings. It's the murder, the sacrifice and murder of Adam. But you know, he's suntanned in the right sort of places, but white everywhere else. You know, a wonderful pair of pictures, I think. They're very naturalistic. They're almost lifelike. And this is the centerpiece of it. That's the centerpiece physically as well as theologically. Pardon me. The lamb is being sacrificed. You've got the fountain of life. The angels around the altar. It's all there. The crowd includes the apostles, elders of the church, and so on. And it's all in a landscape where flowers and plants are painted, and they're apparently from all over the world. And he painted things very, very accurately. And that's a wonderful portrait just by itself, but this is this chap here. You know, what an expression to have. Or what an expression to capture. So the next painting of his that exists is in New York. And this is an unusual picture in a number of ways. It's a diptych. Normally, this scene previously had always been painted horizontally. This one he's done vertically. And what's unusual is that the eye is taken to the top. Sorry, have I got this the right way around? Let me think about this. It's unusual, this one, because you start in one place and you go up to the crucifixion. And Mary Magdalene down here, she's fainted. But there's a great deal of detail in this. And the other panel, you start at the top and go down. This is all about the Last Judgment. So you're led through the stark choices of, do you really want to end up down here? This is very prescient if you think about Hieronymus Bosch, and some of his stuff was all about, you really don't want to go down here, it's not very nice. And there are lots of inscriptions on the painting that you can't see in this, which suggests that the person who commissioned it was not only well read, but wanted Latin and Greek inscriptions in the picture. It's unique in that respect. And here's a little more of the detail of the lighter part of the picture. Now, there's a great deal of discussion in the art world generally about who painted what, and these pictures are no different, really. The experts in quotes, now are agreed that this indeed is by Jan van Eyck. Might have been started by Hubert. Hubert died in 1426. This was started in 1425, rather like the Ghent Altarpiece. A collaboration between the two. And it's very clever in its use of light. You know, the eye is taken immediately to the central figure. The light on the suit of armor of the guard, albeit he's having a doze. And this is believed to be a faithful representation of Jerusalem as it was at the time, which lends some credibility to the story that Philip sent Van Eyck off to the Holy Land to draw the lie of the land for a crusade that he was planning. Whether it's true or not, I've no idea. But the experts are agreed that this is indeed Jerusalem as it was at the time. The next one is the Madonna in a church. Now, most of the paintings you've seen so far are religious. This one's interesting in a number of ways. It was unusual at the time to see her in blue. And she's not... The scale of this in the drawing is that she's not in a church. She is the church. You know, she's dominating the picture. There's a lot of detail in the picture, but it's really all about her. And along the hem of her robe, in Latin, are the words for sun and light, which establish her as the Queen of Heaven. And Van Eyck floods the church with light, casting down on the floor. And she's looking to her left, which suggests that this might have been the panel of a diptych, and there would have been a painting. There'd have been a painting here, but it doesn't exist. No one knows where that is. And here's some detail from it. You see the light is hitting her face, and the Christ child, and the angels in the back. You know, his paintings, if you see them in real life, are worth standing in front of for 10 or 15 minutes because there's so much in them. And everything is there for a reason. Now, you might look at this one and think, well, that's a little dull compared with the other ones we've seen. But this is one of the early examples of landscape painting, and the picture is regarded as very important as a landscape because it's a very early one, and it's the first treatment of a landscape in Netherlandish painting. So it's another first for him. It was owned by a merchant who was also a member of the court, Philip's court, in Bruges. And it was a very popular picture at the time, to the point that he painted a number of others smaller and painted them himself. This one's only 5 inches by 6 inches. Hard to tell them apart, but they're both undoubtedly by Van Eyck. It's not a copy by his workshop. Although it was disputed for a long time, but it was only when X-ray technology came along that the experts were able to say, there's no question, this is by Van Eyck. And this is his first portrait. And Van Eyck is the first great European portrait artist. This is thought to be his earliest surviving portrait, not been able to track down any others. And it had a big effect on the development of portraiture through the years. Of course, this is also not a religious painting. He's holding on to some sort of frame. He's holding a ring. And so people speculate on what it's all about. Some people think because he's holding a ring, he had it commissioned and sent to the young lady he was proposing to marry. And barely visible up here, this little mark, is a feigned monogram of Dürer, which was dated 1492, but which they now know was added by a forger in the 18th century. And this is a sketch that he did preparatory to painting a portrait of the cardinal, and the notes on it are all about what colours to use, what textures he wants, and so on. And he did that as a quick sketch, and that avoided him sitting down with the cardinal and going straight to oil paint and canvas. He could do the quick sketch, make the notes, and go off and produce the picture. And this gentleman pops up a little later on too. The next one that's around, this was the first one to be signed and dated by Van Eyck. and he's just behind this parapet, and there's an inscription, and Van Eyck's signature has been carved into the stone. And this contains some inscriptions in French and Greek. So we don't know much about the man himself, but there's a style occurring in these portraits now. You can see that he's got a way of doing these things. And here's a really serious-looking chap. This was Philip the Good's Chamberlain. He's described in the histories as determined, ruthless, cold, hard-nosed, devoid of idealism. And he was also the governor of Lille. And he was the chap who went to Portugal with Van Eyck to meet Isabella and to say whether she was going to be good enough or not. But there's no flattery. This is the most powerful man in Philip's court. And I think you'll agree there's no flattery in this picture. And this is the one I showed at the start. This is generally believed to be a self-portrait. And what's different about this one compared with the others is he's looking straight at us. And this is the first portrait where the sitter is looking at someone who's looking at the picture. And one of the reasons they think it might be a self-portrait is his hands aren't visible. If you think about the other portraits, there have been hands. None in this one. He's wearing an expensive fur, an expensive turban. But the turban is not a distraction, and neither is the fur. What you're taken to is his face, and he's looking at you directly. The Annunciation, another one in the church, he's in blue again. Probably commissioned by Philip the Good, they think. It's a fictitious church, it's a mix of architectural styles. Scenes from the Old Testament are detailed in the floor tiles. Again, everything's there. Everything's there for a purpose. This is extremely ornate. And she's shown in blue again. The jewels, the wings, everything about it this is an impressively executed picture. But back to religion, and this is my favourite of Van Eyck's. This was another groundbreaking picture. This was the first known double portrait in the world in a domestic setting. And there's intense debate about whether the lady's pregnant or not. And the story is, another thing about this is that Van Eyck is in this picture. It's his reflection in the mirror. Now, I've done a talk on this portrait in the past, and I've had a larger blow-up of it, but it takes a bit of cheek, I think, or the agreement of the people who are paying for the picture to say, well, can I be put in it as well? And I won't intrude, I'll pop myself in the mirror. And there's a big debate about whether she's pregnant or not. And some students at a school that specialise in dressmaking and these sorts of things reproduced the dress, and it took 60 meters of cloth, and it's quite a heavy wool cloth. And they reckoned that if you made it and tugged it up in front of yourself, you couldn't avoid looking pregnant because there's so much material. But what we now know is that Van Eyck never met her. She was dead by the time Van Eyck painted this, and she died in childbirth. So it's now thought that Arnolfini commissioned the portrait as a remembrance of his wife, and the last time he saw her alive, she was pregnant. So it might well be. We'll never know. But again, everything in this picture is there for a purpose. It's to send a message. Now, many Van Eyck experts reckon this is his best picture. This was commissioned by Rollin, the Chancellor Rollin, who was advisor to Philip the Good. And there are a number of things that are unusual about this. One is that Roland is painted, he's the same size as she is. Traditionally in religious painting, Christ or Mary or the Virgin will be larger figures in the picture than anyone else. So there's a degree of, I'm equal in this. And they're not in the center of the picture. This is a technique we saw in the Ghent Altarpiece. They are to one side so he can show something else out of the center. And his sense of perspective is pretty good. I mean, that looks reasonable. The scene outside that perspective is pretty good. Everything again is there for a reason. The angel here is about to put the crown on her head. Lovely stained glass up here, and the child, of course. And the detail in the floor. And that's the center of the picture now. What's interesting about this, I think, if you look at the detail in this first, the plants, these chaps, what are they talking about? Perhaps they've gone outside for a cigarette, I'm not sure. And the detail here, how beautiful this is. Right, think about how much detail there is in that. Now, let me show you how big it is. In real life, it's that size. All of that in that. Here's the cardinal again. It's a lovely picture, I think. At this point, 1435, Philip is so impressed with Van Eyck that he trebles his salary. So he's now one of the highest paid men in the court. Caused something of a controversy amongst the other courtiers. There'll be a great deal of envy in this, and if you think modern politics is nasty, just imagine what it was like then. And this is another one of his. This chap is the man who paid for the painting. So he's got to be in it in a dominant position. She's back in red. St. George is here. And one of the many things that's interesting about this is who are the people in the picture looking at? And she would normally be looking at the Christ child. The Christ child might be looking at her. They're both looking at him. This chap is looking at him. It's all about me in this. And notice he's carrying a pair of spectacles. This is the first time Specsavers would love this. This is the first time spectacles have appeared in a painting. And there are another very interesting feature about this, which I'll come to. Look at the amount of detail in it. And the green parrot and the plants. Even the parrot is looking at the man who paid for the picture. And again, this is a picture that benefits from just looking at and looking at and looking at. And Van Eyck is in it as well, because he's painted himself there, just in this bit. The reflection of the armour, there he is. So he's got a habit of, well, it's not a bad habit, and it's not really a habit, he's only done it twice. And the inscription above the Virgin describes her as being without blemish. And you might think that Van Eyck has put that in because it's a reflection on his opinion of his capability. As a painter, he's without blemish as well. We don't know who this chap is, but he looks pretty serious. He's wearing a medal of the Order of St. Anthony, which was a Bavarian award. And there's some debate about whether Van Eyck painted this one or not. And these debates will go on for ever and ever, I suspect. No doubt about this one, apparently. Because along the outer frame, it says, let me get this right, this gentleman, Jean de Lue, who first opened his eyes on the feast of Saint Ursula in 1401. Pardon me. Now Van Eyck has painted me, you can see where he began it, 1436. And this is another portrait where he's looking at us. So again, unusual, but it really catches you, I think. He's not a member of the court circle, this man. He's a goldsmith, and he's prominent in his local guild, and he's holding a ring. But there's no suggestion that he's about to propose to anyone. Now this is his smallest triptych. When it's closed, it's only 13 inches by 10, so it's about that by about that. So it's portable. It's meant to be carried around and used as a devotional tool. It was owned by an Italian family, the Giustinianis. And the donor is in this as well. Here's the man who paid for it. Very, very ornate picture. Very realistic church interior. Oh, the dogs have arrived. That's in Dresden. And this is it closed. So you might think, first glance, these aren't paintings, these are statues. But they're not, they're wonderful paintings. And look at the dove. Yeah, it's just absolutely wonderful, I think. Now this painting, this is unusual. I don't know whether that's what he intended it to be finished as, or whether it was a preparatory sketch for something. Was it an underdrawing he was going to paint over? We don't know. The original frame was faux marble, which would suggest that it was finished because he bothered to have it framed. And it's thought to be Cologne Cathedral in the background. Back to his religious work. This one's in Frankfurt. Simple interior again. The carpet which pops up frequently. The very ornate chair. The clear glass. The bowl, fresh water. You can see things through the window. You see a lot of these details in a number of his pictures. The lions on this identify this as the throne of Solomon, apparently. And many commentators think that he painted the face based on his wife. He used her as a model for this. I think a lot of his imagined people in his paintings are a very, very similar face. But the experts think that this was more like his wife. And so you can draw your own conclusion, really. I'm not sure. But it's nice to disagree with the experts, even if you're wrong. This is a later photograph of Mr. Arnolfini, holding a folded paper. He was a tradesman, a merchant, so this might be a bill of sale or something to do with his business. And the hands here are like all his hands, are beautifully painted. And artists describe painting hands as an eternal torment. Very, very difficult things to paint. Another Madonna, again in blue. Entirely inside, not in a church and not outside. A rose garden, the fountain of life. It's regarded as one of his most accomplished works because it's full of the effects of light, of colour, of sparkle, all sorts of things in this. And this one's a little bigger. That's this size. So, how do you do it? Except with very fine brushes and knowing what you're doing. Now, I'm not sure he knows how to paint babies. And because these are from paintings that span about 10 or 15 years, he couldn't have used the same one as the model. And perhaps they were all the same, or perhaps he painted one and just thought, well, I'll copy it the next time round. Now, they just don't look terribly realistic to me. I think it's the weakest part is paintwork. Not the quality of the painting, but he can capture people, adults and adult faces and everything else around him. It just seems to me that he doesn't quite catch the nippers. This is his wife. She was of noble lineage, and Philip the Good encouraged the marriage because he wanted Van Eyck, as his court painter, to marry well, as he put it. And there's no question that he painted this, because the inscription says, "My husband painted me on the 17th of June at the age of 33. An astonishing headscarf in this. But no question about who she is. And the only one that he painted of her that exists today. This one's in Madrid, and Vera and I are going to be seeing it in a couple of weeks' time. Similar structure to the Ghent Altarpiece, except that it's one picture, 3 parts of it, down there, and this bit. It's argued about. It's thought now to be a copy of a lost original. But who knows, that could change. That's I can't remember what the size of that one is. And this is the last of his pictures that I've shown. I've tracked down what I think is everything that's clearly his, that exists today, is in the talk. Some of them are quarrelled about whether he did them or not. Opinions very divided on this one, St. Jerome. I don't know how many lions that have been around for him to copy, to model for this. It doesn't look terribly realistic. The story is that the lion befriended St. Jerome when he removed a thorn from its paw. And this is very typical of some other painters of the time. These are all the tools of his trade. The face is very, very good, I think. But it just seems to me that it doesn't ring true with the others that we've seen. But of course, we don't know how many other paintings he did that no longer exist. So I'm just using what is around. He's painted in the robes of a cardinal. He never was a cardinal. The most consistent school of thought is that he started work on it before he died, and it was finished off by his studio. And the way that studios worked, the master would do the serious bit, maybe the face, and then there'd be someone in the studio who was very good at flowers, someone who was very good at animals. They all had different specialisms, and he'd do the sketch and then say, okay, you put a bunch of crocuses in there or whatever. But it doesn't do it for me. But I'm not an expert. Sadly, he died when he was only 43. He was buried in the church. His younger brother, of whom very little is known, asked for him to be moved to a more important part of the church, which was apparently done. And then the church collapsed. So there's no trace of the grave today. But between them, they had fabulous observational skills, and they could paint really, really well. They understood what they were doing. And I think that combination of detail, perspective, and everything else makes him pretty unique. Van Eyck is also mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles. And that was because the Germans, in 1916, nicked the Ghent Altarpiece and put it in a salt mine somewhere in Germany. And the Allies said, okay, well, we'll sign the Treaty of Versailles and we'll stop the war, but only if you give the picture back. And so they did. And one of the panels of the Ghent Altarpiece is a copy that was painted in the 1930s because the original was stolen and it's one of the big mysteries of art theft of the last 100 years. And that statue's in Ghent. So I hope I've shown you what a good painter I think he is, and how interesting his work is. And thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions if you wish.
Geoff, thanks for that great presentation.
Thank you.
Were any or are any of his paintings in private hands?
Quite possibly.
Ah, right. Yeah, I'm thinking of how much they'd be worth these days, because some of the incredible amounts being paid for paintings.
Yeah, millions upon millions, I would think. I mean, the panel that was pinched out of the Ghent Altarpiece, that's got to be in private hands somewhere. Yeah.
No.
They're too well known, but art theft is a serious problem in the world, and not just by individuals, but by governments.
On a technical point, how did you manage to get hold of all these wonderful slides from these different museums?
Well, most of them I get off the... Well, in fact, I get all of them off the internet. But some art galleries, if you do a copy of a picture off the internet, like the one I had of the Ghent Altarpiece with the people in front of it, it's a really poor quality image. Most of the stuff on the internet looks good on a laptop or a screen, but it's rubbish when you blow it up. And what I discovered was, when I started to do some work on the Arnolfini Portrait, was that you could go to the National Gallery website and get a really super quality image. There are, I think, 8 images you can get of the Arnolfini Portrait, the portrait itself, and some of the details. And they want £60 each for them. And I thought that was a bit steep. So I did some research and found that they have, you can get what they call an academic waiver. So academics who are writing, the key thing is not to make a profit out of it. If it's not profitable, if you're not doing it for profit, I should say, then you can get an academic let. And so I wrote to them and said that I do talks for the U3A. We don't charge for the talks. I don't charge for doing them. And they said, oh, fair enough then. And I have that arrangement now with the National Gallery, with the Prado, and with the Thyssen collection in Madrid. So I can get some better quality pictures. And also, many art books, the photographs in the books, if you scan them, they're really good quality. So it's a combination of things. But it takes time. and I reckon that for an hour's talk, I probably do 20 plus hours of preparation, trying to find the right thing and research it, because most of these, I'm not an expert by any means. I see something, and this my next talk I might do is about Holbein's painting The Ambassadors, and Joy said to me one day, that's a really interesting picture, and I wasn't familiar with it. And what you find is, as I did with the Arnolfini Portrait, if you Google The Ambassadors or the Arnolfini Portrait, or almost any painting, you'll find 100,000 articles written about it. And some will be arguing it's a fraud, some will be arguing it isn't, but there'll be lots and lots of detail about it. And so if you're prepared to put the time in, you can learn. I'm interested in the subject, happily, so I certainly don't resent doing it. I enjoy doing it. But it does take a great deal of time.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Geoff. So that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. As well as the technical brilliance I think you've got with this man and the technical expertise he's got, you seem to have these little hidden secrets in there, which are sort of you've got to sort of look for, and that really is something, I think. Anyway, thank you very much, Geoff. Could you please show your appreciation in the usual way?
Thank you.